Zethkalar pressed his scaled face against the viewing port of the coalition ship Ironwing. Stars stretched endlessly before him, but his mind was not on the beauty of space. His thoughts were dark, focused on the enemy that waited somewhere, in the black void. The Krax warrior had seen many battles in his long life. His people were known across the galaxy as fierce fighters who showed no mercy to their enemies. Their claws could tear through metal, and their thick scales could stop most weapons. But even the mighty Krax Empire had been forced to join this strange alliance. The Void Swarm was coming. They were creatures that ate entire worlds, turning everything they touched into more of themselves. No single species could stand against them alone. So here he was, standing on a ship filled with monsters from across the galaxy, all united by fear of something even worse. General Vextar of the Hegemony commanded the ship. The tall, gray-skinned alien had 4 arms and eyes like black holes. His people were known for their cold military mind and perfect battle plans. Beside him stood Captain Gorth of the Gorvani. The massive bear-like creature could crush a man's head with one hand. His people fought like wild animals, throwing themselves into battle without fear of death. Then there were the Veltar. These snake-like beings moved through shadows, killing their enemies before anyone knew they were there. Their poison could drop a Gorvani in seconds. They whispered among themselves in their hissing language, always planning, always watching. All of these species had fought wars with each other for hundreds of years. The Krax had burned Veltar worlds. The Gorvani had eaten Krax prisoners. The Hegemony had enslaved entire populations, but now they worked together because they had no choice. And then there were the humans. Zethkalar looked across the ship's main deck at the newest members of their coalition. They looked so weak compared to the other warriors. Their skin was soft and pink, easily cut by any blade. They had no claws, no thick scales, no poison, no extra arms. They were smaller than the Gorvani, weaker than the Krax, and slower than the Veltar. Captain Jake Morrison led the human group. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and calm blue eyes. He spoke quietly to his soldiers, never raising his voice or making threats like the other commanders did. His uniform was plain compared to the decorated armor worn by other species. Sergeant Lisa Chen stood beside him, a small woman with dark hair tied back. She looked like she could barely lift a Krax weapon, yet she carried herself with confidence. Corporal Danny Rodriguez was even younger, probably fresh from whatever world the HFY. Humans called home. Private Kevin Brooks looked like he should be in school, not preparing for Galactic War. There was also Dr. Ryan Foster, their scientist, and Medic Amy Watson. They seemed more interested in their data pads than in weapons training. Major Tracy, Williams, and Lieutenant Colonel Pete Sanders rounded out the senior human staff. All of them looked ordinary, unremarkable. The other species on the ship treated the humans with barely hidden contempt. The Gorvani made jokes about using them as emergency food. The Veltar whispered that they would be the first to die in battle. Even Zethkalar's own people saw them as a burden that the coalition was forced to carry. But something about the humans bothered Zethkalar. It was not their weakness that troubled him. Weak species existed throughout the galaxy, and most had already been conquered or destroyed. What bothered him was how calm they seemed. Every other species on the ship showed some sign of stress. The Gorvani were restless, always looking for fights among themselves. The Veltar were paranoid, suspicious of everyone around them. His own Krax warriors sharpened their claws and tested their weapons constantly. The humans just waited. They followed orders, did their jobs, and waited. They did not seem afraid of the Void Swarm. They did not seem worried about fighting alongside their natural enemies. They acted like this was just another day at work. Zethkalar had fought many different species in his time as a warrior. He knew the signs of fear, of anger, of bloodlust. He could read the battle readiness of any creature by watching how they moved, how they held their weapons, how they looked at their enemies. But the humans gave him nothing to read. They were blank, neutral, patient. Captain Morrison approached. The main tactical display where all the senior officers were gathering for the daily briefing. General Vextar was explaining their current position and the latest intelligence about Void Swarm movements. The creatures had been spotted near several mining colonies in the outer systems. Soon the Coalition fleet would have to engage them in battle. Each species commander spoke about their readiness for combat. The Gorvani wanted to charge straight at the enemy. The Veltar preferred stealth attacks from multiple directions. The Cracks suggested overwhelming force to crush the enemy quickly. All of them spoke with passion, with anger, with the fire of warriors ready for battle. When it came time for Captain Morrison to speak, he simply nodded and said, "We're ready, General." That was it. No grand speeches about honor or victory. No threats against the enemy. No detailed battle plans or requests for specific positions in the formation. Just a simple statement that they were ready to fight. General Vextar seemed surprised by the brief response, but moved on to other matters. The meeting ended with each species returning to their own sections of the ship to prepare for the coming battle. Zethkalar found himself following the humans back to their area. Their section was smaller than the others, reflecting their lower status in the Coalition. But it was organized perfectly. Every piece of equipment had its place. Every weapon was clean and ready. Every soldier knew exactly what they were supposed to do. He watched as they went through their preparations. They checked their weapons with methodical care, but without the ritual significance that other species placed on such activities. They reviewed their battle plans but did not argue or debate like the other commanders did. They ate their meals, but did not feast and boast like warriors before battle. They were acting like this was a job. Not a holy war, not a fight for survival, not a test of honor and strength. Just a job that needed to be done. This disturbed Zethkalar more than any threat or insult could have. Warriors were supposed to feel something before battle. Fear, anger, excitement, bloodlust, something that showed they understood what was coming. But these humans seemed to feel nothing at all. As he returned to his own section, Zethkalar wondered if the humans truly understood what they were about to face. The Void Swarm was not like other enemies. They were horror-made real creatures that turned living beings into extensions of their hive mind. They showed no mercy, felt no pain, and never stopped until everything was consumed. Perhaps the humans were simply too young as a species to understand real danger. Perhaps their homeworld had been too peaceful, and they had never faced a true enemy before. Perhaps they would learn quickly when the fighting began. But as Zethkalar cleaned his own weapons and prepared his armor, he could not shake the feeling that he was missing something important about these strange, quiet creatures who called themselves human. The alarms began screaming at 600 hours. Zethkalar rolled from his sleeping mat, already reaching for his weapons before his eyes had fully opened. Around him, other Cracks warriors did the same, their training making their movements automatic. "All hands to battle stations," came General Vextar's voice over the ship's communication system. "Void Swarm contacts detected near Kepler mining station. We engage in 30 minutes. Zethkalar strapped on his combat armor, the familiar weight of the metal plates settling on his shoulders like an old friend. He checked his plasma rifle and made sure his combat claws were properly sharpened. Around him, his fellow warriors prepared with the same deadly efficiency that had made the Cracks feared across the galaxy. The ship shook as the engines pushed them toward the battle zone. Through the corridors, Zethkalar could hear the sounds of other species preparing for war. The Gorvani were singing their death songs, deep voices that echoed through the metal halls. The Veltar moved silently, but he could smell their combat pheromones in the air. The hegemony troops marched in perfect formation, their boots creating a rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. And somewhere in this chaos, the humans were preparing too. When Zethkalar reached his battle station, he could see the tactical display, showing enemy positions. The Void Swarm had surrounded Kepler Station with dozens of their bioships. The creatures looked like massive insects crossed with warships, their hulls pulsing with organic life. Intelligence reports said they were converting the mining station's workers into more Void Swarm creatures. The Coalition fleet spread into attack formation. Each species took their preferred positions. The Gorvani ships charged straight at the enemy center, their crews roaring for battle. The Veltar vessels slipped around the edges, preparing to strike at weak points. The crack ships, including the Iron Wing, formed the main battle line, and the human ship, the small vessel they called Liberty, took position near the rear of the formation. Many of the coalition warriors laughed at this. The humans were staying safe while the real fighters did the work. But Zeth-Kalar noticed that Captain Morrison had positioned his ship where it could respond to threats from any direction. Not hiding. Watching. The battle began when the Gorvani reached the enemy line. Their ships crashed into the Void Swarm vessels like hammers hitting glass. The creatures' bioships twisted and writhed, trying to wrap around the Gorvani vessels with tentacle-like appendages. Plasma fire and organic acid filled the space between the fleets. The Veltar struck next, their ships appearing from behind asteroids to hit the Void Swarm from unexpected angles. Their weapons were precise, cutting through enemy weak points, with surgical accuracy. Then the cracks entered the fight. Zeth-Kalar felt the familiar surge of battle joy as their weapons opened fire. His people had perfected the art of overwhelming force. Their plasma cannons could cut through the thickest armor, and their boarding parties were legendary for their savagery. But the Void Swarm was unlike any enemy they had faced before. When the bioships were damaged, they did not retreat or explode. Instead, they split apart like cells dividing, creating more smaller ships. When their creatures were killed, they simply regrew from the remains. And all the while, they kept trying to get boarding parties onto the coalition ships. The battle turned into a nightmare of close combat when several Void Swarm pods penetrated the Iron Wing's hull. The creatures inside were like nothing in Zeth-Kalar's experience. They had too many teeth, too many claws, and they moved in perfect coordination as if controlled by a single mind. Zeth-Kalar found himself fighting in Corridor 7, near the human section of the ship. His plasma rifle cut down 3 of the creatures, but more kept coming. Their acid blood ate through the metal floor, and their screams seemed to come from inside his head. He was reloading his weapon when he heard something that made no sense in the middle of a life-or-death battle. Laughter. Private Kevin Brooks was laughing as he set explosive charges in the corridor ahead, not the mad laughter of someone who had lost their mind, but the genuine amusement of someone enjoying their work. "Hey, Danny," Brooks called to Corporal Rodriguez. "Remember that thing we learned in basic training? The one about turning enemy advantages against them? You mean the part where Sergeant Baker made us memorize 50 different ways to use improvised explosives?" Rodriguez replied, calmly shooting a Void Swarm creature while he talked. "That's the one." Zeth-Kalar watched in amazement as the two humans worked together with perfect coordination. They were not just fighting the creatures, they were studying them. Every time a Void Swarm creature used a tactic, the humans found a way to counter it. When the creatures tried to overwhelm them with numbers, the humans used narrow corridors to limit how many could attack at once. When the creatures used their acid blood as a weapon, the humans turned it against them by making them bleed onto each other. Sergeant Lisa Chen appeared around a corner, carrying a weapon that Zeth-Kalar had never seen before. It fired some kind of net that wrapped around the Void Swarm creatures and tightened until they could not move. "Medic Watson's idea," Chen explained when she saw his surprised look.
She noticed their exoskeleton joints have a specific weak point. This net puts pressure on all those points at once. Behind her came Medic Amy Watson herself, but she was not hiding in safety as Zeth-Kalar had expected. She was treating wounded
coalition soldiers right in the middle of the battle zone, completely ignoring the danger around her. When she finished with a wounded Krax warrior, she moved to help an injured Void Swarm creature that was trapped under debris. "What are you doing?" Zeth-Kalar demanded. "That thing is our enemy." Watson looked up at him with calm eyes. "It's hurt and trapped. That makes it my patient." She treated the creature's wounds with the same care she had shown the coalition soldier, even though it had been trying to kill them all just minutes before. When she was done, she calmly injected it with something that made it fall asleep. "Sedative," she explained. "For study later. We need to understand how they work if we want to fight them effectively." The battle in their section of the ship ended when Major Tracy Williams arrived with a squad of human soldiers. They had developed new tactics during the fighting, using the ship's own systems against the invaders. They pumped sections full of gases that the creatures could not breathe, changed the gravity to trap them against walls, and used the artificial intelligence to predict where the creatures would go next. When it was over, the void swarm creatures in their area were either dead or captured. The humans had suffered fewer casualties than any other species, despite having the least natural advantages for combat. But what disturbed Zethkalar most was how they acted after the battle. The other species celebrated their victories, mourned their dead, and boasted about their heroic actions. The Gorvani sang songs about warriors who had died gloriously. The Veltar quietly honored those who had fallen. The Cracks sharpened their claws and prepared for the next battle. The humans did paperwork. They documented everything that had happened, analyzed what had worked and what had not, and began planning improvements for next time. Captain Morrison walked through their section of the ship, talking quietly with each of his soldiers about what they had learned. Dr. Foster was already studying the captured void swarm creatures, taking detailed notes about their biology and behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Sanders was reviewing the tactical data, looking for patterns in how the enemy fought. They treated the entire battle like it had been a learning experience, not a fight for survival. As Zethkalar cleaned his weapons and prepared for whatever came next, he found himself thinking about what he had witnessed. The humans had not fought like any warrior species he had ever seen. They showed no anger toward their enemies, no joy in victory, no fear of death. They fought with the same calm efficiency they showed in everything else. But they had been effective. More effective than species with natural weapons, thick armor, or centuries of military tradition. They had adapted to a completely unknown enemy faster than anyone else, and they had found ways to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. For the first time since the humans had joined the coalition, Zethkalar began to wonder if there was more to them than their weak appearance suggested. But he was not sure he wanted to know what that something was. 3 weeks after the battle at Kepler Station, the coalition fleet had grown larger. More ships arrived daily, bringing warriors from across the galaxy to join the fight against the Void Swarm. But with each victory, the enemy seemed to learn and adapt just as quickly as they did. Zethkalar stood in the main briefing room of the Iron Wing, watching the senior commanders argue about their next move. Intelligence reports showed a massive Void Swarm stronghold in the Centauri system. It was heavily defended and surrounded by asteroid fields that would make any direct assault costly. General Vextar pointed at the tactical display with one of his 4 arms. We must strike quickly before they can strengthen their defenses further. Every day we wait, more systems fall to their expansion. Captain Gorth of the Gorvani slammed his massive fist on the table. My warriors are ready to die for this cause. We charge straight at their strongest point and break it with our bare hands if necessary. The Veltar commander, whose name was difficult for other species to pronounce, hissed softly. Direct assault is foolish when stealth can achieve the same goal with fewer losses. We slip past their outer defenses and strike at their command structures. Commander Theklan of the Cracks Navy nodded his scaled head. Overwhelming firepower has always been the answer. We bring our largest ships and pound their stronghold into dust. Each species proposed the same strategies they always used. The Gorvani wanted to charge directly at the enemy. The Veltar wanted to sneak around and strike from hiding. The Cracks wanted to use massive weapons to destroy everything. The Hegemony wanted to use perfect military formations and superior tactics. All of their plans were variations of things they had tried before. All of them would work to some degree, but would cost many lives and might not end the threat completely. Captain Morrison had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, listening to the debate. When the other commanders finished presenting their ideas, General Vextar turned to him with barely hidden impatience. "And what do the humans suggest?" Vextar asked. His tone made it clear that he did not expect anything useful. Morrison stood up slowly and walked to the tactical display. He did not look at the other commanders as he spoke. Instead, he studied the star maps and intelligence data with the same calm attention he gave everything else. "We don't attack their stronghold," he said quietly. The room fell silent. "Captain," Gorth growled low in his throat. "You want us to run from the fight?" "No," Morrison replied. We want to make them run from the fight. He touched the display, highlighting several points around the Centauri system. The Void Swarm operates as a hive mind. Everything they do is coordinated through central command nodes. But they're not just a military force. They're a conversion system. They turn other species into more of themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Sanders stepped forward, carrying a data pad filled with information. We've been studying the creatures we captured at Kepler Station. Dr. Foster has made some interesting discoveries about how their hive mind works. Morrison nodded to Sanders, who began explaining what they had learned. The Void Swarm doesn't just kill their enemies. They absorb them. Every creature they convert becomes part of their collective consciousness. But this process requires enormous amounts of energy and resources. So, Commander Theklan asked impatiently. Morrison smiled, for the first time since Zethkalar had met him. It was not a pleasant expression. So we give them something that will poison their collective consciousness. We make them afraid. The other commanders looked confused. Fear was not something they associated with the Void Swarm. The creatures seemed to have no emotion except hunger and the drive to expand. Dr. Foster entered the briefing room carrying samples of the captured creatures in containment units. He was followed by Major Tracy Williams and several other human officers who had been working on something in secret for the past 3 weeks. Fear is a survival mechanism, Foster explained as he set up his equipment. Every intelligent species develops it as a way to avoid danger, but the Void Swarm gave up individual fear when they joined the hive mind. The collective consciousness is supposed to protect them from the weakness of individual emotion. He activated one of the containment units, showing a single Void Swarm creature floating in a specially designed chamber. The creature looked different from the ones they had fought at Kepler Station. This one moved slowly, almost hesitantly, and its eyes showed something that looked like individual thought. We've been experimenting with ways to isolate individual creatures from the hive mind, Foster continued. When they're cut off from the collective consciousness, they remember what it feels like to be alone, to be afraid, to face death as an individual rather than as part of an unstoppable force. Major Williams stepped forward with a grim expression. We can create weapons that temporarily disrupt their hive mind connections. When that happens, the individual creatures experience terror for the first time in their existence. And when they reconnect to the hive mind, they carry that terror with them. Morrison turned back to the tactical display. We don't need to destroy their stronghold. We need to make the entire hive mind experience fear. Once they understand what it means to be afraid, they'll start making mistakes. They'll hesitate. They'll retreat. The other commanders stared at him in silence. What he was proposing was not just warfare, it was psychological torture on a species-wide level. General Vextar was the first to speak. This is not how honorable warriors fight their battles. Honor doesn't matter if we lose, Morrison replied calmly. The Void Swarm doesn't fight with honor. They convert entire populations into extensions of themselves. They turn parents into weapons against their own children. They show no mercy, so we show none either. Captain Gorth growled again. The Gorvani way is to face our enemies with strength and courage, not with tricks and fear. Morrison looked at him with those calm blue eyes. The Gorvani way has worked well against other warrior species. But the Void Swarm isn't a warrior species. They're a force of nature, like a plague or a natural disaster. You can't fight a plague with courage. You fight it with medicine, with science, with whatever tools work. Commander Theklan leaned forward, his scaled face showing interest despite his previous skepticism. How do you propose to deliver these fear weapons to their stronghold? Sanders stepped forward with detailed battle plans. We use the other species' natural advantages as cover for our real objective. The Gorvani charge creates a distraction. The Veltar stealth units deliver our fear weapons to key points. The Crack's firepower keeps their attention focused on the main battle. Meanwhile, human specialists infiltrate their command structures and begin the psychological conversion process. As the humans explained their plan in detail, Zethkalar found himself both impressed and disturbed. The strategy was brilliant, using each species' strengths while hiding the true purpose of the attack, but it was also completely ruthless. They were planning to drive an entire species insane with fear. What bothered him most was how calmly the humans discussed it. They talked about psychological torture, the same way they talked about equipment maintenance or meal schedules. It was just another problem to be solved with the right tools and methods. The debate continued for hours, but eventually all the commanders agreed to try Morrison's plan. They had no better alternatives, and the war was not going well enough to reject any strategy that might work. As the meeting ended and the various species returned to their ships to prepare, Zethkalar lingered in the briefing room. He watched the humans pack up their equipment and data with the same methodical efficiency they showed in everything else. "Captain Morrison," he called out as the human leader prepared to leave. Morrison turned to look at him with those steady blue eyes. "Yes, Zethkalar. Your people have fought wars like this before, haven't they? Wars where you use the enemy's mind against them?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost sad. "We've fought many wars, Zethkalar. Some against enemies who were monsters. Some against enemies who were just like us. We learned a long time ago that the most dangerous enemy is the one who thinks like you do. So we learned to think like our enemies, to understand what they fear, what they value, what will break them. And that doesn't bother you?" Morrison looked at the tactical display, still showing the Void Swarm stronghold they would soon attack. "It bothers me more than you know. But the alternative is losing, and losing means every species in the galaxy becomes part of the Void Swarm. So we do what has to be done, and we carry the cost of doing it." As Morrison left the briefing room, Zethkalar remained behind, staring at the tactical display and wondering what other prices the humans had already paid for their victories. The mission to implement the human fear weapon strategy began 3 days later. Zethkalar found himself assigned to Strike Team Alpha, led by Major Tracy Williams. The team was a mix of species, carefully chosen to represent each group's particular strengths. Besides Zethkalar and Major Williams, the team included Veltar operative Sisheth, whose stealth abilities were legendary, and Gorvani warrior Tokagrim, whose massive strength could break through almost any barrier. Dr. Foster had also been assigned to the team as their scientific specialist. Their mission was to infiltrate one of the outer defense platforms of the Void Swarm stronghold and deploy the fear weapons at the center of their local hive mind network, while the main fleet engaged the enemy in a massive battle. The strike teams would plant their psychological weapons and begin the process of spreading terror through the collective consciousness. The plan required them to be captured. This was the part that bothered Zethkalar most. Major Williams had explained it calmly during their mission briefing. The Void Swarm would try to convert any prisoners they took, connecting them to the hive mind in order to steal their knowledge and add their biological distinctiveness to the collective. But during the conversion process, there would be a brief moment when the new mind was connected to the hive but not yet fully integrated. That was when they would strike. Dr. Foster had developed a device that could be implanted in their bodies, hidden from the Void Swarm's detection methods. When activated during the conversion process, it would flood the hive mind connection with artificially generated fear patterns, causing a cascade effect that would spread panic through every connected creature. The device required the host to be conscious and connected to the hive mind to work, which meant they had to let themselves be captured and partially converted before they could deploy their weapon. "This is insane," Tokagrim growled as their transport ship approached the target platform. "Warriors fight their enemies, they don't surrender to them." Major Williams checked her equipment one final time. "Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them think they've won," Sisheth hissed softly in agreement. "The Veltar have used similar tactics. Appear weak to hide your true strength." But Zethkalar could see that this was different from normal deception tactics. The humans were not just pretending to be weak. They were deliberately putting themselves in the most dangerous possible situation because that was where their weapon would be most effective. Dr. Foster seemed almost excited about the mission. "We'll finally get to see how the Void Swarm conversion process works from the inside. The data we collect will be invaluable for future operations." "Assuming we survive," Zethkalar muttered. "Oh, we'll survive," Foster replied with disturbing confidence. "The implants have a 73% success rate in our simulations. Those are acceptable odds." Zethkalar stared at the human scientist. You're talking about a 27% chance of death or worse, permanent conversion to the enemy. Foster nodded calmly. Yes, but a 73% chance of dealing a major blow to the Void Swarm collective consciousness. The benefits outweigh the risks. Their transport ship was detected by the Void Swarm defense platform exactly as planned. The human pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Brooks, made it look like they were trying to escape. But the ship's engines had been secretly sabotaged to fail at the right moment. The Void Swarm captured them with tentacled grappler ships that dragged their transport into the platform's docking bay. What followed was unlike any battle Zethkalar had ever experienced. The Void Swarm creatures did not try to kill them. They tried to capture them alive. This made fighting them almost harder than facing an enemy that wanted to destroy them. The creatures used stunning weapons and nets, trying to disable rather than eliminate the strike team. Major Williams coordinated their resistance, but it was carefully planned to fail. They had to make it look like they were fighting with everything they had while actually ensuring they would be captured. It was a performance, and the humans were very good at it. When they were finally overwhelmed and taken prisoner, the Void Swarm creatures transported them to the center of the platform. The conversion chambers were biological structures that looked like giant flowers made of meat and bone. Each team member was placed in a separate chamber where organic tendrils began to connect to their nervous systems. The conversion process was horrifying. Zethkalar felt alien thoughts pushing into his mind, trying to override his individual consciousness and make him part of the collective. But the human scientists had prepared them for this. They knew what to expect and how to resist long enough for their weapons to deploy. Through the hive-mind connection, he could sense his teammates undergoing the same process. Takrim was fighting the mental invasion with typical Gorvani fury, his rage acting as a barrier against the collective consciousness. Sisheth was using Veltar mental discipline techniques to maintain her individual identity. Dr. Foster seemed almost fascinated by the experience, studying the conversion process even as it happened to him. And Major Williams was coordinating their response through the hive-mind connection itself. This was what truly amazed Zethkalar. The human officer was using the enemy's own communication network to give orders to her team. She had somehow learned to think in the patterns the Void Swarm used for their collective consciousness, allowing her to send messages that the hive mind interpreted as its own thoughts. "Deploy weapons now," came Williams's mental command through the hive-mind connection. The implants activated simultaneously across all 5 team members. Suddenly, the collective consciousness was flooded with pure artificial terror, not the normal fear that individual creatures felt, but a concentrated essence of panic and dread that had been distilled and weaponized by human science. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every Void Swarm creature connected to the local hive mind network began screaming. Not the coordinated battle cries they normally used, but individual voices expressing personal terror for the first time in their existence. Through the hive-mind connection, Zethkalar could feel the panic spreading. The creatures were experiencing what it meant to be alone, to face death as individuals rather than as part of an immortal collective. They were remembering what they had been before they joined the hive mind, and that memory filled them with desperate fear. The conversion chambers released them as the platform systems began to fail. Void Swarm creatures ran in all directions, no longer coordinated by their collective consciousness. Some tried to hide, others attacked each other, in panic. The perfect unity of the hive mind was shattered by individual terror. Dr. Foster was taking notes even as they escaped from the conversion chambers. "Remarkable," he said calmly. "The cascade effect is even more efficient than we predicted. Fear spreads through their network faster than any coherent thought." Major Williams was already planning their extraction. The main battle should be reaching its peak now. The enemy will be too confused to coordinate an effective defense. As they fought their way off the platform, Zethkalar witnessed something that disturbed him more than the Void Swarm conversion chambers had. The human weapons were not just military tools. They were designed to cause maximum psychological damage. Every device Dr. Foster used was calculated to increase the enemy's terror and confusion. Stun weapons that caused hallucinations as well as paralysis. sonic devices that played sounds specifically chosen to trigger panic responses. Even their escape route was planned to maximize the psychological impact on any void swarm creatures that witnessed it. The humans were not just winning the battle, they were destroying the enemy's ability to think rationally. When they finally reached their extraction point and were picked up by a coalition rescue ship, Zethkalar found himself looking at his human teammates with new understanding. They had just deliberately allowed themselves to be partially converted by the enemy in order to plant psychological weapons in their collective consciousness. And they treated it like just another successful mission. Initial deployment appears successful, Major Williams reported to Captain Morrison over the communication system. Fear cascade is spreading through local hive mind networks. Recommend immediate follow-up strikes while enemy coordination is disrupted. Dr. Foster was already preparing his data for analysis. We'll need to study the long-term effects on their collective consciousness. This could be the key to ending the war. As their ship returned to the main fleet, Zethkalar realized that the humans had not just won a battle. They had introduced a new kind of warfare to the galaxy, not just the destruction of bodies or ships, but the destruction of the enemy's ability to think and plan as a unified force. It was brilliantly effective. It was also terrifying to witness. And Zethkalar was beginning to understand that the humans had been fighting wars like this for a very long time. The human psychological warfare campaign succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within 2 weeks of the first fear weapon deployment, entire void swarm fleets were turning on each other. The perfect unity of their hive mind had been shattered by the introduction of individual terror, and the cascade effect continued to spread through their network. But victory was changing the humans in ways that disturbed Zethkalar more than the enemy ever had. He first noticed it during a routine mission briefing aboard the Iron Wing. The coalition forces were preparing to assault a void swarm logistics base that intelligence suggested was trying to quarantine itself from the infected parts of their network. Captain Morrison was explaining the attack plan to the assembled commanders. The enemy is attempting to create isolated pockets of their collective consciousness, Morrison said, pointing at the tactical display. We can't allow them to recover from our psychological attacks. Every isolated group that survives becomes a potential seed for rebuilding their hive mind. General Vextar nodded approvingly. So we destroy these isolated groups before they can spread. Not exactly, Morrison replied. We convert them. Dr. Foster stepped forward with a new device that looked similar to the fear weapons they had used before but more complex. We've improved our understanding of how their collective consciousness works. Instead of just introducing fear, we can now program specific thoughts and behaviors into isolated groups. Zethkalar felt a chill run down his scaled spine. You're talking about controlling them. We're talking about ending the war, Morrison said calmly. Every void swarm creature we convert to our side is one less enemy we have to fight, and one more ally in our campaign against the remaining hive mind networks. The plan that followed was methodical and ruthless. Human specialists would infiltrate the isolated void swarm groups and use their psychological weapons to reprogram the creatures. Instead of feeling fear, these converted creatures would feel loyalty to the coalition. Instead of trying to expand the hive mind, they would work to destroy it. Major Tracy Williams had been promoted to colonel after the success of the fear weapon missions. She now commanded an entire division of human psychological warfare specialists. When Zethkalar saw her again, she looked different. Thinner, more focused, with eyes that seemed to look through people instead of at them. The enemy made this personal when they tried to convert us, she explained during a private conversation. Now we're returning the favor. Every creature we reprogram is justice for what they tried to do to us and billions of other innocent beings. But the human definition of justice was proving to be very thorough. Zethkalar was assigned to observe one of their conversion operations on a captured void swarm research facility. The humans had isolated a group of several hundred creatures and were systematically reprogramming their collective consciousness. Dr. Foster worked with the same clinical detachment he had always shown, but his methods had become more sophisticated. He could now map individual thoughts within the hive mind and alter them with surgical precision, Fear was just one tool in his arsenal. He could also implant guilt, shame, despair, or any other emotion that served their strategic goals. The key is understanding what each creature was before they joined the hive mind, Foster explained as he worked. Many of them were converted against their will from other species. Deep in their collective consciousness, they remember their original identities. We just help them remember more clearly. Zethkalar watched as Foster activated his device on a group of creatures that had originally been members of the peaceful Andorian farming communities. Under the influence of the psychological weapon, they began to remember their former lives, their families, their homes that had been destroyed by the Void Swarm expansion. The pain of those memories was overwhelming. The creatures screamed and writhed as decades of suppressed individual identity came flooding back. But instead of being driven insane by the experience, they were filled with burning hatred for the hive mind that had stolen their lives. Perfect, Foster said, making notes on his data pad. Controlled rage is much more useful than random fear. These units will be highly motivated to destroy other Void Swarm facilities. Private Kevin Brooks was still cracking jokes, but they had gotten darker. As he prepared capture nets for the converted creatures, he laughed about how easy it was to turn the enemy into their own worst nightmare. They wanted to make us part of their collective consciousness, he said. Instead, we made them part of our war machine. Sergeant Lisa Chen had developed new interrogation techniques that could extract information from Void Swarm prisoners without actually converting them. She used a combination of psychological pressure and targeted fear responses to break down their mental defenses. When Zethkalar asked her about the ethics of torturing sentient beings, her response chilled him. They're not sentient in the way we understand it, she said matter-of-factly. Individual Void Swarm creatures are more like biological computers, following programmed instructions. We're just reprogramming them with better instructions. Medic Amy Watson still treated wounded enemies alongside allies, but her definition of treatment had changed. She now performed psychological evaluations on every patient, determining which ones could be converted and which ones were too dangerous to keep alive. Her medical decisions were based on strategic value rather than the traditional oath to do no harm. The greatest harm would be allowing the Void Swarm to continue existing, she explained when Zethkalar questioned her new methods. Every creature we save becomes a weapon against their species. That's the most healing we can do in this situation. The converted Void Swarm creatures were indeed effective weapons. They knew all the enemy's tactics, all their weaknesses, all their secret facilities and plans. More importantly, they could spread the psychological weapons through direct contact with other hive mind networks, creating a viral effect that destroyed collective consciousness from within. But watching them in action was disturbing. The converted creatures fought with desperate fury, not the calm coordination they had shown as part of the original hive mind. They seemed to enjoy causing pain to their former allies, taking revenge for their lost individual identities. The humans encouraged this behavior, using the converted creature's anger as a motivation tool. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Sanders had become the Coalition's expert on using converted creatures as intelligence assets. His methods for extracting information from the enemy were extremely effective, but they involved psychological torture techniques that would have been considered war crimes if used against any other species. The Void Swarm doesn't recognize the concept of war crimes, Sanders explained when Zethkalar raised his concerns. They violated every principle of civilized warfare by converting entire populations against their will. We're just using their own methods against them. Captain Morrison, now promoted to Admiral, coordinated the entire psychological warfare campaign from the bridge of the Iron Wing. He had maps showing the spread of converted creatures through the remaining Void Swarm networks, tracking the collapse of their collective consciousness like a disease spreading through a body. We're winning, Morrison told the assembled coalition leaders during a strategy meeting. Within 6 months, there won't be a unified Void Swarm collective consciousness left in this galaxy. The remaining creatures will either be converted to our side or isolated in small groups that pose no threat to anyone. General Vextar looked at the tactical displays showing the extent of human psychological warfare operations. Your methods are highly effective, Admiral. But I must ask, what happens to your specialists when the war is over? Will they be able to return to peaceful activities after spending years perfecting techniques for psychological manipulation and conversion? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weight that had not been there when Zethkalar first met him. That's a problem we'll deal with when we reach it, General. Right now, our focus has to be on ending this war before the Void Swarm can adapt to our methods. As the meeting ended and the various commanders returned to their duties, Zethkalar found himself wondering if the Coalition was still fighting the same war they had started. The humans had turned the conflict into something beyond mere warfare. It had become a campaign to rewrite the fundamental nature of an entire species, and the humans themselves were being rewritten in the process. They were still effective, still intelligent, still capable of mercy when it served their strategic goals. But they had become something different from the quiet, unremarkable people who had first joined the Coalition. They had become very good at being monsters when monsters were needed. The final battle against the Void Swarm took place in their original homeworld system, deep in the galactic core where few other species had ever ventured. The space around their planet pulsed with organic energy, and bioships the size of moons defended what remained of their central hive mind. Zethkalar stood on the bridge of the Iron Wing, watching the tactical displays as the Coalition fleet prepared for what Admiral Morrison had promised would be the last major engagement of the war. The human psychological warfare campaign had been devastatingly successful. Most of the Void Swarm collective consciousness had been either destroyed or converted to fight alongside the Coalition. But what remained was the original core of their species, the ancient creatures who had first created the hive mind billions of years ago. These beings were too old and too deeply integrated into their collective consciousness to be converted by human psychological weapons. They would have to be destroyed completely. Final target analysis complete, reported Colonel Tracy Williams from her position at the Psychological Warfare Station. Her appearance had changed dramatically over the months of warfare. She was thin to the point of appearing skeletal, and her eyes had developed a constant, distant look as if she was always partially connected to the enemy's thoughts. The core consciousness consists of approximately 50,000 original Void Swarm entities, she continued. They've isolated themselves completely from the infected networks and are operating on pre-conversion protocols only. Standard psychological weapons will not be effective. Admiral Morrison nodded calmly. He had also changed during the war, becoming more focused and precise in his movements and speech. Then we used the final option. Dr. Foster stepped forward, carrying a device that was larger and more complex than any of his previous psychological weapons. The extinction protocol is ready for deployment, he announced. But I must remind everyone that this weapon cannot be controlled once activated. It will destroy every trace of collective consciousness in the target area. The extinction protocol was the ultimate expression of human psychological warfare. Instead of converting or reprogramming the enemy, it completely destroyed their ability to maintain any form of shared consciousness. Individual creatures caught in its effect would be reduced to primitive animal intelligence, incapable of complex thought or cooperation. Zethkalar had read the technical specifications, and they horrified him. The weapon would not just kill the Void Swarm, it would reduce them to a state worse than death, stripping away everything that made them sentient beings. Are we certain this is necessary? General Vextar asked. Perhaps we could attempt one more conversion operation. Morrison shook his head. The core consciousness is too old and too stable. They've had billions of years to perfect their collective thought patterns. Conversion would take decades, and we don't have that kind of time. Every day we delay, they're working on defenses against our psychological weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Pete Sanders presented the latest intelligence reports. They've already developed partial immunity to fear-based attacks. Within a year, they'll probably be able to protect their entire species from our conversion methods. This is our only chance to end the war permanently. The battle began with a coordinated assault by all coalition forces. The Gorvani charged directly at the enemy's strongest defenses, their warriors singing death songs that echoed through space. The Veltar used their stealth capabilities to strike at communication nodes throughout the system. The Cracks brought their most powerful weapons to bear on the massive bioships protecting the homeworld. But the real attack was happening on a level that most of the coalition forces could not see. Human psychological warfare specialists, led by Major Danny Rodriguez and Sergeant Kevin Brooks, were infiltrating the outer layers of the core consciousness, preparing the way for the extinction protocol. Zeth Kalar watched the battle through both visual displays and the psychological warfare monitors that the humans had installed throughout the ship. On the regular tactical screens, it looked like a conventional space battle. Ships exchanging fire, fighters engaging in aerial combat, boarding parties assaulting enemy vessels. On the psychological warfare displays, it looked like something from a nightmare. The human specialists were moving through the void swarm collective consciousness like a virus, destroying thought patterns and severing connections between individual minds. The ancient creatures were fighting back with mental defenses that had been refined over geological time periods, but the humans were adapting faster than the enemy could respond. Dr. Foster was coordinating the psychological assault from his position at the central control station. His methods had evolved far beyond simple fear weapons. He now had devices that could rewrite memory, alter perception, and destroy the basic cognitive functions that allowed conscious thought. Beginning final deployment sequence, Foster announced. All personnel should prepare for extinction protocol activation. The device he activated was different from anything Zeth Kalar had seen during the war. Instead of targeting specific thoughts or emotions, it attacked the fundamental structures that allowed minds to connect and share information. The effect spread through the void swarm consciousness like acid through living tissue, dissolving the bonds that held their collective intelligence together. The results were immediate and horrifying. Across the battle zone, void swarm creatures suddenly stopped their coordinated attacks and began moving randomly. Their bioships lost formation and started drifting aimlessly through space. The massive defensive structures around their homeworld went silent as the minds controlling them simply ceased to function. Through the ship's communication system, Zeth Kalar could hear reports from other coalition vessels describing the same phenomenon. The enemy was not dying. They were being reduced to the mental level of simple animals, incapable of speech, planning, or even basic tool use. Extinction protocol deployment successful, reported Colonel Williams. Collective consciousness dissolution at 97% and climbing. Estimated time to complete cognitive breakdown, 47 minutes. As the battle continued around them, the coalition forces found themselves fighting an enemy that could no longer fight back effectively. Individual void swarm creatures still had their biological weapons and natural defenses, but they could no longer coordinate their attacks or adapt to changing tactical situations. It was not warfare anymore. It was extermination. Admiral Morrison stood at the center of the bridge, watching his psychological warfare specialists complete the destruction of an entire species' ability to think. His expression was calm, professional, almost bored. This was just another successful mission for him and his people. "Sir," came a report from the communications officer, "the Gorvani are requesting permission to board the enemy homeworld for final cleansing operations." "Granted," Morrison replied without hesitation. "But remind Captain Gorth that we need some specimens left alive for study. Dr. Foster wants to examine the long-term effects of the extinction protocol." As the coalition forces prepared to land, on the void swarm homeworld, Zeth Kalar found himself thinking about everything he had witnessed during the war. The humans had arrived as seemingly weak creatures with no natural weapons or defenses. They had appeared to be the least dangerous species in the coalition, but they had ended the war by destroying the enemy's ability to think, not through superior firepower or better tactics, but by understanding how consciousness worked, and then systematically dismantling it. They had turned warfare into a science, and their science had proven more devastating than any weapon ever created. "Zeth Kalar," Admiral Morrison called out, interrupting his thoughts. "You've been observing our operations throughout this campaign. What's your assessment of human military effectiveness?" Zeth Kalar looked at the Admiral, then at the psychological warfare displays showing the complete cognitive collapse of the void swarm collective consciousness. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Your people are not warriors in any sense that other species would recognize," he said. "Warriors fight with honor, with rage, with the desire to prove their strength against worthy opponents. You fight with precision, with calculation, with the goal of making your enemies incapable of fighting back. Morrison nodded slowly. And that makes you the most dangerous species in the galaxy, Zethkalar finished. Because you can choose to be monsters when monsters are needed, then choose to be something else when the situation changes. The rest of us are what we are. You are what you need to be. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical displays that showed the final collapse of Void Swarm resistance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass the entire war they had just finished. The universe is full of monsters, Zethkalar. Some are born that way, like your people's reputation suggests. Others become monsters through necessity, like we have. But the real monsters are the ones who choose to be monsters for pleasure, for conquest, for the simple joy of causing suffering. The Void Swarm was that kind of monster, and they had to be stopped. As the last reports came in confirming the complete success of the extinction protocol, Zethkalar realized that the war was over. But he was no longer certain who had actually won.